Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is September 28, 2021, and today we're going to watch a Kyle Kulinski video talking about the fact that Andrew Yang started a new political party. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, Yang's new thing apparently is called the Forward Party. I think if there's one thing that the US does not need right now, it's another non-socialist political party. We have plenty of things. I mean, just even between the Green Party and MPP, that's one party too many, and I would say that the extra party is MPP, since the Greens were there first, have a lot of dedicated activists in their ranks, and the MPP thinks that the Greens are, quote, too far left. Yeah, as a Marxist, I would disagree. As somebody watching capitalism implode, I also would disagree. We have to do everything we can to try to build a movement which can at least absorb some of the shock on working people, the next time that there's a massive crisis, and another, because that's what capitalism does. It just creates crises and inequality and instability, and that's terrible for working people who bear the brunt of this. And then if we can take power, all the better. But at a minimum, we can barely even absorb the shocks at the present moment. Anyway, let's get into the video, and we will continue the commentary from there.
So Andrew Yang started a new third party. Of course, he ran for president, and it ran in the Democratic primary, didn't win, ran for mayor of New York, didn't win, even though he was a big favorite for most of the race. So now he's starting a third party. It's called the Forward Party, and we just got the 6 planks of the Forward Party. So this is the overall philosophy here and policy approach, which will inform the direction of the party. Let's take a look at it. So Dave Weigel says, if it's no longer embargoed, here are the 6 planks of the Forward Party. This is in Andrew Yang's new book, and he lays it out. Number 1, ranked choice voting and open primaries. Now I'll come back and discuss all these. Number 2, fact-based governance. Number 3, human-centered capitalism. Number 4, effective and modern government. Number 5, UBI. And number 6, grace and tolerance.
Okay, so let's start with some preliminary comments before we get into what Kyle Kulinski thinks about it, and then we'll comment on that as well. So, first of all, Yang is a joke and a meme and a grifter, and the guy is just a self-promoter. He brought up, I think his one valuable contribution was just talking more about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Okay, that's important to understand, but his other contribution, the UBI that he's very well known for, that's not a solution, not really, and we will talk about that more in a moment. So, plank number 1, ranked choice voting and open primaries. Okay, that's your first thing. I don't even know what to say. I mean, ranked choice voting is fine. However, you can see examples of the capitalist, Democratic and Republican parties already gaming that. In some areas, it has been helpful. In other areas, it hasn't led to that much of a change. It's fine. I'm totally, ranked choice voting, fine. But as far as you have 6 planks and this is one of them, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I've seen elections with ranked choice voting where it really just comes down to the Democrat and the Republican in the end anyway. So I think that this may be less of a game changer than people realize in terms of taking the basically, frankly, hopeless capitalist election system and trying to spruce it up. You'd maybe get a little bit. And, maybe people would be able to leverage the little bit that they gain from that. I don't know. But, it's just kind of weak. Anyway, and open primaries, that can go a couple of ways. And, let me also say, Kyle is doing this off of a tweet. I really would have preferred, it's just so shallow. I wish he had actually gone to, like, Yang's book, for example. It would be more journalism than just punditry, because we get no discussion here. We get no background on any of them. But anyway, open primaries. Okay, you can get people who are participating in your primary specifically to fuck it up. that can happen with open primaries. I know that in some cases they have favored progressive candidates. Let's keep in mind here, Socialism for All, the channel you're listening to, this is a Marxist channel. We lean pretty strongly Marxist-Leninist, and we don't believe you're going to get real change through the capitalist election system. If you can elect communists here or there, maybe that's worth it. Some people even debate that today. But basically, the Kyle Kulinski approach is the elect better Democrats approach. He's a social democrat, wants to keep capitalism, and we know that in capitalism, capitalists use the power that they have, which is in the definition of capitalism, industries in private hands run for profit. Well, they use that economic power and translate it into political power. So no matter what you do to them, they eventually use that power and leverage to get their political power back. It happened in the United States. This isn't theoretical. It's how the New Deal was undone in this country. So bad approach. This is Kyle's very limited upper middle class outlook on this issue. So yeah, anyway, RCV and open primaries. This is kind of a joke in terms of we're facing all the problems that we're facing right now, and that's one of your 6 platforms. All right, 2, fact-based governance. This is an empty talking point. What does that mean? The Democrats right now say that they are the party of science, and then they just do more sophisticated COVID denial and more sophisticated climate denial in their own way. You want an example of the COVID denial? The World Health Organization said that we should all keep wearing masks. The CDC did not. Look at what's happening now. So keep wearing masks, get your vaccine, keep social distancing. But at a structural level, the Biden administration basically told businesses around the country, you no longer need to have those accommodations, for mask wearing and all that stuff, and to protect people from the spread of a highly destructive, highly contagious illness. Yeah, I mean, that just opened the floodgates for the surge of Delta that we're experiencing now. Anyway, follow World Health Organization recommendations. They tend to be better than the US's. Anyway, so fact-based governance, that really means nothing. Particularly, we're going to look at point 3, human-centered capitalism. Okay, so you want fact-based governance, but you also want capitalism. So let's look at this slogan. I said it at the time about Yang. Capitalism is not human-centered, nor can it be. It's in the name, capitalism. It's centered around capital. And here's the thing about capitalists. Their economic and political and all the other interests are diametrically opposed to everyone else's. Capitalism is creating a large class of dispossessed workers called the proletariat. It's in the interest of the proletariat to abolish private property, to take all of the industry that the capitalists hold and to socialize it, collectivize it. You need to take it out of the for-profit system and operate that industry, which exists, to meet human need, not to make capitalists rich. Human-centered capitalism is a contradiction in terms. Or, well, actually, capitalism is centered on some humans, capitalists. But because of the way that capitalism divides people into 2 great classes, the capitalists and the proletariat, it can only be centered on some of those humans. And the fact that he's indicated a preference for capitalism, where the capitalist class rules over socialism when the proletariat rules, then you've decided which humans you want that to be centered on. Now, I'm sure he's talking about some kind of social democracy, but this is window dressing for the fact that capitalism is an engine of suffering, war, inequality, dependence, and crisis. That's what capitalism is. We've seen this over the last couple of centuries now. So this is totally worthless and empty so far. 4, effective and modern government. Again, this is an empty catchphrase. What does that even mean? I wish we had an explanation. 5, universal basic income. So there's a video by Paul Cockshott, who is a Marxist economist, and he has a video talking about UBI and its conservative origins. You may have heard, or you maybe haven't, that Richard Nixon back in the 70s was interested in UBI. Basically, conservatives wanted to get rid of unemployment insurance because it was competing with wages. So UBI was a way to have people like not starve, but also not compete with wages at all so the capitalists could keep wages lower. This is not a good system. We shouldn't have it now. Capitalists know that we are entering into a total crisis of wages, and they know that they have stifled the ability of workers to form labor unions. Even shitty, controlled, corrupt labor unions, you can't even make those because the labor laws are so onerous that business owners are able to terrorize workers out of organizing in basically, like, it's the playing field is so far skewed towards business owners that workers barely stand a chance, and therefore way fewer labor unions than workers want are actually getting created. So we have nothing really driving wages up. Costs of living are rising, though, so workers are just getting crunched. Some of them know that they need to do something about this. But anyway, the UBI is not a solution. I'll link to Paul Cockshott on that. Just a little disclaimer about Paul Cockshott. I appreciate his economic work as a Marxist. He also makes forays into other things like gender, which I don't think he is really in any position to talk about. He at least has some really pretty offensive takes on that whole situation. I may do a video about that at some point, but let that also be said. All right, and then 6, grace and tolerance. This is not a separate plank. This is all, human-centered, whatever. So this is as empty as you would expect from Andrew Yang, who's a joke and a meme. And, plank 7 is free whipped cream to be sprayed into your mouth personally by Andrew Yang, for people who remember that bizarre PR stunt that he did. So anyway, there's really nothing here. I'm sure that the Forward Party is going to fizzle out like everything else that Yang has done so far. So let's take a look at Kyle Kulinski's comments now.
Okay. So let's go through these one by one. Ranked choice voting in open primaries. Am I for or against? I am for. I'm completely in favor of those things. I oftentimes call a third-party approach to politics in the current U.S. system self-disenfranchisement, because the elites and the establishment want nothing more than you to waste all your political energy on a project that's not going to get off the ground.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. And so Kyle's position is that voting third party is self-disenfranchisement in the current system. And yeah, third parties don't win. I think that they can do some good where they get on a city council or something like that. But overall, I don't think that this system, no matter who you vote in, is necessarily going to be able to change that much. You would have to get people in much bigger numbers, but you'd also have to have people from a real political party with a real political program to do anything. And most of the parties out there are really just aiming too low versus, the kind of crises that we're in and the kind of change that we need. So, voting for people who aren't Democrats, Republicans, usually gets you nowhere, but also trying to take over the Democratic Party gets you nowhere. So it really looks like the, reality is we're locked out of the system. It kind of makes sense, though, because the United States government is built for one purpose: maintaining capitalism. That's what this is about. The fundamental idea behind the United States is that society should be ruled by rich property owners. That's capitalism. That's what this country is all about. The government is designed to do that, and that's the model of, the nation state that they're interested in. It's something run by rich property owners. That's how they think that the world should work. They don't think that the proletariat, working people who don't own property, they don't think that we should really have a say in government or, more of an advisory role, if anything. So this is just the situation we're in. Is ranked choice voting going to dramatically change that? I don't think so. Am I against it? No. But remember, Kyle Kulinski is in the elect better Democrats approach, or just generally that electoralism is some kind of a significant path to reforming literally the empire, which is responsible for militarily violently crushing any form of resistance to empire, which crops up anywhere in the world. I would rethink that.
They would love it if anti-establishment energy is wasted on that front.
Okay, one more point I forgot to add that reminded me. Is it a total waste to get involved with a local Green Party or some other small local political organization? No, it isn't. Because we need workers to organize. We need networks of people familiar with who is in their community and willing to work on projects, even against all odds. We need to know who is willing to roll up their sleeves and actually try to help fight a bad landlord or help fight a bad employer or whatever it is. We need to network, and you cannot do that inside the Democratic Party. So Kyle is looking really more at just voting, whereas the reality is organizations such as, the Green Party, it's the obvious sort of left third party in the United States. Of course, there are others like PSL, etc. But the idea is it's not just about the election. There's also lots of local activism, local networking, local education campaigns, mutual aid networks. You can meet people through these organizations. You're not going to meet them in the Democratic Party. So that's part of the conversation here, too. Kyle is just looking for the most bourgeois definitions of success, winning elections, etc. Building worker power really isn't just about that. But, that seems to be what he thinks and how he thinks of it. Continuing.
So, but, what do I always tell you guys? As long as you don't put the cart before the horse, well, then you can be really effective doing a third-party approach. But the answer is you have to do ranked choice voting first. If you first get ranked choice voting all throughout the U.S., well, then all of a sudden, the third-party approach is no longer self-disenfranchisement. And now it matters, and it's helpful, and you give yourself a fighting chance, whether you run as an independent or a member of a different third party. You actually could make a difference, and it's not like people cannot argue in that situation that there's a spoiler effect, that your vote is wasted on somebody who has no chance. Because if it's ranked choice voting, your vote will just go to, if your candidate and you're voting for third party doesn't even come close to winning, then your vote redirects and goes down the line to your second choice, so on and so forth. So if we implement ranked choice voting everywhere, then the third party approach is no longer self-disenfranchisement. And I think it becomes a lot more practical and a lot more reasonable to put all your energy on that front. So this is an example of credit to Andrew Yang here. He's not putting the cart before the horse. He's saying, no, we're going to do this in the right order. I'm not going to just self-disenfranchise with a third party that's going to go nowhere. We have to first get ranked choice voting and have open primaries. Okay, great. So I'm in favor of plank number one.
Okay, so in conclusion, I'm not opposed to this. I would like to see fewer Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. government. But again, is this going to get all the change that we need? No. Why? Because the 1% is the 1%. They own everything. And worldwide, the U.S. is needed for as long as it can deliver on what is needed as the military muscle of international capitalism. That's what's needed. So, and they'll keep running some country as that, probably the U.S., but it probably will be the U.S. until the last days of capitalism. That would be my guess. I see no reason why it wouldn't. The U.S. is geographically in a position where it really can't be attacked very easily at all. And I don't know that imperialism has that much longer to go. It's either going to perpetuate itself and destroy the planet, or it's going to deteriorate and then socialism will rise in its place. Of course, that's going to be a struggle. It's not going to just happen automatically. But the U.S. is definitely the barrier to that. So you have imperialists putting a lot of stock in the existence of the U.S. as this military power that is going to enforce their system globally, which is the point of the U.S. And Kyle's looking at it like, just some other political contest where, the person who gets the most votes wins. It's just really dramatically oversimplifying, the extent to which the 1% is willing to go to hang on to their power. All right, moving on. Also, when I said fewer Democrats and Republicans, that goes for other right-wing parties as well, like the Libertarians or whatever other kind of like centrist, quote-unquote, right-wing parties are also being put out there. Continuing.
Blank number 2, fact-based governance. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. It's so broad and vague in general. I mean, libertarians argue they do fact-based governance. Socialists argue they do fact-based governance. You can look at a fact and have a totally different interpretation of that fact. So here's a good example. You can have a giant economic downturn, and people on the right will argue, well, one of the reasons for this downturn is the big money government stimulus package that we just passed. It is actively hurting the economy and increasing our debt and leading to inflation, and that's unacceptable. Then you have people on the left who could look at that same economic downturn and say, the problem with this economic downturn is we didn't do a stimulus that was nearly big enough. Our stimulus was too small. If it was bigger, we would have created more jobs, created more opportunity, given the working class more capital so that they can live their lives, and it would have helped the economy more.
Let's just pause for a moment I agree on the main point here that what does that mean? And that's basically what I said. Like the Democrats say that they're science-based or whatever. They're not. It's really easy to say that. It's just a vague and empty talking point from an empty, vague meme of a politician like Andrew Yang. Anyway, but Kyle's point here, I love how, but then the left says more Keynesianism. There's a whole world to the left of New Deal politics. Kyle doesn't want to acknowledge it. But the way that he's talking about, we do a stimulus to give more capital to working people. Yeah, that's not capital when you give people money to live on. But this is what you get over at Secular Talk. Continuing.
So, in other words, you could look at the same set of facts and come to wildly different conclusions based on those facts. So when you say fact-based governance, that's too broad. That's too general. Because ideology necessarily has a role to play, no matter who you are. Nobody's free of ideology in politics. And if you are, you're a dumbass. Like, you have to have some sort of perspective. You have to have some sort of filter and model through which you view the world. There is no such thing as like, no, I'm actually above it all and ideology is not a thing to me. There is no such thing as non-ideological. It's a farce. So when you say fact-based governance, that doesn't make much sense. That's too vague, that's too broad, that's too general, and it doesn't really mean anything.
So let me jump in here. While that's a fair point that he's making, in sociology it's called value freedom. Everybody brings their set of values. Let's get a little more specific. From a Marxist perspective, we talk about class interests. So what we have going on right now and have had for several thousand years is class struggle. This has happened after people moved out of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which is basically our natural state. Like other animals, they hunt and they gather. For the animals that hunt. But in other words, they just live freely, consuming food, resting, doing their thing, semi-nomadic, etc. At some point on the Earth scale, and even on the human evolution scale, fairly recently, settled into more permanent settlements and agriculture. And there's a gradient there. There's like semi-nomadism. There are people who live somewhat hunter-gatherer but engage in limited agriculture, etc. But anyway, at some point, the settlements got bigger and bigger. People really became more sedentary, started building cities, accumulating surplus, and we began class struggle over who controls the surplus. This has gone through several different modes as technology has changed. So most recently, we went from feudalism into capitalism. And we're now fighting to get out of capitalism and move into a system called socialism, which is a transitional stage that fights with capitalism to eventually pave the way for communism. All of this is theorized based on studying past transitions throughout history of what is going to come next. So capitalism has created a large dispossessed class. Our interest is in abolishing private property, Capitalists' interest is in maintaining private property because they own it, they benefit from it. That's in their interest. So, yes, you need to look at class interests, and then within the broad class interests of capitalist versus proletariat, there are other sub-hierarchies. For example, there's significant in the United States racial hierarchies. Those exist throughout society, but you particularly see it in the stratification of the working class. I mean, capitalists can fend for themselves. That said, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are most of the presidents. That is really more reflective of who the ruling class is. And again, that hierarchy is felt throughout society. Also, there is gender inequality and sex inequality. So there's a lot to look at in terms of subgroups. So yeah, interests. It's not just facts. People have different and conflicting interests in capitalist society. Part of the point of socialism is creating a society which no longer has those contradictions in it. It no longer has those opposing interests baked into it. So I know that this is way beyond what is normally discussed at secular talk, but I mean, he's right on the point that people have class interests and they're going to interpret the facts in those limited ways. Again, what is the solution? To create a society which does not have opposing class interests. This is entirely possible. Continuing.
I mean, it's easy for people to look at this and say, I'm pro-facts. But everybody thinks they're pro-facts. What, maybe 10 or 20% of people are silly enough and open and honest enough to be like, no, I'm against facts. I don't believe in facts. I don't even know if that's true. But even if it is, 80% of people think, yeah, of course I'm basing everything off facts. So I don't know what that means, and that's kind of silly. The third thing, human-centered capitalism. I don't know about that, dog.
So this surprises me because Kyle has spoken against socialism on grounds of, authoritarianism, etc. He's a social democrat. He often speaks explicitly in favor of social democracy. Well, social democracy is the quote-unquote human-centered capitalism. Of course, social democracy, like in the US, only came about because of the existence of Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, and massive pressure from US radicals to go beyond capitalism. And so they settled, capitalists being the they, threw a bone and tried to draw a class piece with, here are some public programs, but please let us stay in power. And then after a combination of brutal repression of radicals and also some of the progressive reformers being content and just stopping, that was the end of the movement for quite a while in at least any significant way. This is the big difference between the first half of the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century in the US. Much more intense class struggle in the first half, and then much more complacency and deterioration in the second half till you get where we are today. Anyway, back to Kyle.
Because, okay, so there's a number of ways to interpret this. One of the things I'll say is this. If you really believed in human-centered capitalism, you could argue human-centered capitalism is actually social democracy. Like, that's what the Swedish or Norwegian model is. That's what the Scandinavian model is in a variety of those countries. And I say that because there are still elements of capitalism in those countries, but it's just a better hybrid with socialism. There is more socialism in those countries, so certain things are taken off the table. Now, I'm very sympathetic to social democracy, as everybody knows. But that leads me to ask Andrew Yang, well, why wouldn't you just say social democracy is what we're advocating for? And if his response is, well, I don't really believe in social democracy, then I say to you, well, what the hell is human-centered capitalism then? What does that mean? What does human-centered capitalism mean? Because there also is an argument, now let me put on my further lefty hat here for a second. There's also an argument that that's a contradiction in terms. It's not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because capitalism, by its very nature, is not geared towards the flourishing of human beings. I mean, the goal of capitalism is increased profit for the corporations that are partaking in it, for the businesses that are partaking in it. And as Noam Chomsky famously says, under this conception of the world, private vices yield public benefit. And that that just doesn't happen. If you put the profit first and foremost, then the human beings definitionally come second, or even further down the list, third, fourth, whatever it might be. So, not even sure human-centered capitalism, as he might define it, is possible. And namely because of this. And I've talked about this with him. He came on Crystal Kyle and Friends, and we gave him a bunch of difficult questions. And, one of the things I pointed out is during his presidential campaign, he wanted to put sunset provisions on all government regulations. And so we have to revisit them every 5 years or 10 years or whatever it was. That's a terrible idea. And that would not be human-centered capitalism. That would be like right-wing libertarianism, sort of flirting with an Ayn Rand type effect on that front, and that the results of that would be disastrous.
So Kyle's got more to say, but let me jump in with, wasn't that one of the things about Yang, is that he was often called a libertarian? I remember watching Yang in a clip from Fox News in which he said he is not a socialist. He's an anti-socialist. That's not that unusual from somebody running for president, obviously. But there were many people saying Yang is a libertarian. I always thought of Yang as too much of a joke to even be bothered to, get that deeply into it. But anyway, as for the rest of what Kyle's saying, this is what I said before, obviously. So if you want to understand a little bit more about Scandinavia, which, social democrats like Kyle Kulinski are so big on all the time, well, these are hangers-on of imperialism. They're not socialist countries. And if you want to understand more of what's going on in, let's say, Finland, so another channel, Finnish Bolshevik, probably a lot of people have heard of it, recently did a video on the Finland education system and how it came to be so good, and how, like many other things in non-socialist, social democratic countries throughout Europe, have been under attack from the austerity push and rollbacks and cutbacks, how it is being, reduced to far less than it originally was. So, spoiler alert, it was the work of socialists and communists who made it what it was in the first place, even though the country never fully had a anti-capitalist revolution. So anyway, this is just a problem in general, as I mentioned before, with social democrats like Kyle Kulinski, is that they want to take credit, or give credit, rather. They're taking the credit in the name of capitalism. They want to give capitalism all the credit for all the reforms within social democracy, when in fact it's radicals who fought for those reforms against the capitalists. But somehow we want to credit the system of capitalism with, maintaining those systems. Also, Finnish Bolshevik made an excellent point, which is why is Finland always held up as this sterling example? Because it's not a socialist country. It's held up as an example within imperialist countries because it never went fully socialist, and therefore it is, quote, safe for them to laud its successes. Whereas, people trying to look at the clash, for example, between the USA and the USSR as a simple national rivalry. It's country against country. You're not looking deeply enough. This was a conflict between systems. It was a conflict between capitalism and socialism, different modes of production. It was a struggle over industry, not just who can do capitalism better. It was a struggle for control of industry, either by tiny minority of people called capitalists or the vast majority of working masses. That's what was going on there. So anytime that there's a success in a country which is actually waging a war on capitalists and suppressing capitalists, and the working class is in power, capitalist countries are not going to celebrate. They're either going to ignore or minimize, downplay, and dismiss any success stories from within a socialist country. You can count on that. And Kyle Kulinski, I don't think, is that much of an exception to that rule. Let's continue.
So human-centered capitalism, I don't really know what that means. Maybe you can make an argument it's social democracy, but I don't think he would say it's social democracy if you ask him more detail on it. So then that leaves us with just this, again, a vague notion of like reform, but don't reform too much. I don't know, man. Maybe in some ways we need to reform a lot, and we need to sort of upend the way the system is done and do a page one rewrite and start from scratch on certain fronts. Because, and here's one more point on this, which is human-centered capitalism, that to me is too concrete, because it sort of shuts the door on more elements of democracy in the workplace. So more worker-owned co-ops, more egalitarianism in the workplace. Because we do have this contradiction in American life, which is we espouse the virtues of democracy, but the place where we spend most of our waking time in the workplace, it's a tyranny. It's a dictatorship. It's a rigid hierarchy where you have the owner at the top and then the boss underneath them and then the workers underneath them. And whatever they tell you to do, you have to do within reason. And it's like, well, that's not democracy. You can't say politically democracy is great, but in the business place, it's always terrible. And human-centered capitalism sort of shuts the door on more elements of workplace democracy. And I think we could use some more elements of workplace democracy. I think that's a very nuanced conversation to get into and a complex conversation. I have a lot more to say about it, so we'll shut the door on that for now. But human-centered capitalism shuts the door on further workplace democracy, and I'm not a big fan of that. I think we should leave the door open in some ways to more democracy in the workplace. All right.
I find it funny how heavily Kyle is qualifying all of those comments. Like, we should have limited amounts of some little bit of workplace democracy, a little bit where we can, and maybe around the edges and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. You're talking about basically some pretty empty sketches of ideas here. I don't know how much you can even say. Let's go on.
Then he says, takes home the vague first prize. I mean, this is effective in modern government. That's the number 4 thing. Again, I don't know what that means. Effective in modern government. If I'm being kind, my interpretation of that would be you need to like keep up with the times and don't let technology outpace the needs of the people. So you can't just have, because he was big on this in his presidential campaign, don't let the job automation take away the best paying jobs from U.S. workers. And you have to have a way to transition into this new economy where it's more technological, and we can't just sit idly by and let the automation crush the American people. That's my kind of interpretation of what he's saying there. And that is true, that we need to not let that happen. But to just broadly say effective in modern government, again, this is one of those ones where I think everybody would say, I believe in effective in modern government. You could get a hardcore right-winger who would say, of course I think we should have effective in modern government. You know what I mean? So, very vague. All right, the 5th.
Okay, yeah. So, again, I basically agree. There's not much to add because there's not really much there. The only thing I think I could say at this point is when Yang was talking about, we're entering an age of really high technology, and you've got to catch people up with that. I mean, this is a thing. I was just having a conversation the other day about the sweeping changes that technology is bringing in. Like, you can have, voice recognition for different things as like a kind of biometrics for like customer service, calling into certain companies. They can like recognize you by your voice. There's just a bewildering amount of changes taking place that really were not clearly imaginable 20 years ago. Or if they were imaginable in some vague way, the idea that we would just be ankle deep in all this stuff, relatively short time down the road, it's bewildering. And we're really not in the United States, well, not we, capitalists are not, with their education system, educating people well enough to not just, quote, be competitive in that world, that's like a capitalist talking point, but to just keep up with and interpret the changes that are happening in society. There's massive scientific advances going on all the time, massive ones. And if you're not educating people well, they can easily fall way behind, become confused, disoriented. And we see it right now, where right-wing political efforts try to capitalize on that fear and confusion of people who have been left behind in terms of education, are undereducated, and simply just can't comprehend the world around them anymore, and then start falling for right-wing political ploys. It's a huge problem. So yes, I think we need a much better education system, for example. But, meanwhile, you got one of the major political parties in the United States is trying to outlaw discussions of racism in history. So this is the situation in which we're living. The odds of it getting dramatically worse are pretty significant, actually, because they're so hell-bent. The reactionaries in the U.S. are so hell-bent on maintaining and amplifying their power. They're willing to go to basically any lengths. I mean, you look at on Twitter just yesterday, red COVID was trending. What's red COVID? Well, it means that in counties that skew towards Trump or the Republican Party in general, they are dying of COVID at like 4 or 5 times the rate that blue-leaning counties that vote Democrat are dying. They have literally made a self-destructing voter base, and that is in large part due to all the misinformation that they're pushing about COVID. So it's like, I don't know, maybe we will see in the next 10 years like a collapse of the reactionary voter base. Who the hell knows? It's a very unstable situation, and let's get back to the video.
One, universal basic income. Totally agree with him on this. The only asterisk I would put is it would need to be crystal clear that we're not trying to cut any of the current social safety net programs with the UBI. The UBI should be supplemental on top of our current social safety net programs. So, and to be fair, when I asked Andrew Yang in our podcast with him, he said very clearly, I don't want to cut the social safety net. I want UBI to be on top of it. Okay, fair enough. There was a debate and an argument and about whether or not that was true beforehand and how he crafted it and created the policy, but he did say to me he wants UBI on top of the social safety net program. So number 5, like number 1, I'm totally in favor of. And then number 6.
So I gave my comments about that before. Like I said, now that I mentioned the Yang libertarian thing, again, UBI, basically a conservative proposal. And again, it was from capitalists who wanted to keep wages low and get rid of the unemployment compensation system. So also, Kyle did kind of breeze over this, but it initially was going to, from what I recall reading during the 2019-2020 primary, it was going to cut into existing programs that people would be getting, and they'd kind of just lump all the payments into that. I think he skimmed over that. And also, Andrew Yang, again, is a joke and a meme and a politician, and he's going to tell you what you want to hear. The guy is all grift, no integrity, and you're just going to take him at his word? Come on. So, no, there are many better solutions to the challenges facing people than UBI. For example, decommodify food and shelter. How about that for a start? So people just don't have the bills in the first place. Oh, but that would involve taking things off of the market, and capitalists don't want that. No, see, that's what we actually need to do, is take basic essentials out of the market so that housing is not considered a commodity. It's not considered something that you can just buy, sell, and hoard for profit. Okay? That's what you need to do. That's the only thing, not co-ops, not other stuff. That's what you need to do to actually challenge capital and to move into a different system, is you take things off the market. You make them non-negotiable, not for trade or sale, just for use. That's the idea here. Again, trending on Twitter just a couple of days ago, there was a big story about Zillow. Zillow.com, big real estate website, collects data on hundreds of millions of people looking for houses during this housing crisis. And they are now in the business, as are similar companies, of buying up large collections of houses in a given market, marking them up so prices just rise, and then selling them back to people in that area because they know what people can afford, and they're going to drive those prices for their own company's profit to the absolute max that people can bear, and maybe a little bit more, and then they're going to just reap huge amounts of profits. They're preying on something that people this is a basic need, shelter. You know, if you want to have a stable life, you need bathrooms and kitchens and bedrooms that are clean and sanitary, reliably usable. People need shelter. And you have these companies using all of these data that they collect from people to swoop in and game it. I was just talking the other day when that Zillow story was going around on Twitter. They've been looking for a house, and they get the Zillow emails. And they said that they, you know, as we were talking, they looked through the last email that they saw from Zillow, and they were like, here's a house in your area. And it was like, value of this house at this time last year was $380,000, and the value at this time this year is $480,000. So did that house just magically gain, 25% of value? No, it's games being played with basic human needs. And what we have is a homelessness crisis in a country with millions of empty homes. So that's what's going on here. All right, anyway, back to the video.
He said one of their planks is grace and tolerance. I assume that just means general equality. He wants it to be a big tent in the sense that you have in all different races and different genders and stuff like that. I have no problem with grace and tolerance. Grace and tolerance are wonderful things, but again, I do think it's a little overly broad and should be more specific. Now, I'm sure that Andrew Yang does give more specifics on all of these things in his book, but you guys know, and I've said this before in the previous segment, the reason why I'm not too hot on this project, I mean, there's a number of reasons, but he's a very unique individual with his own very unique ideology, and I don't think it is a movement-building ideology. I don't think that this is what sparks millions and millions more people to create a winning coalition to take over U.S. politics. I think ultimately what will happen is he will, even though he's saying, I want to do ranked choice voting everywhere first. That's great. He's right about that. But I don't think they'll get there on that front. So ultimately he will be sort of taking 2% or 3% and just playing with his little 2% or 3% on his own. And that is functionally self-disenfranchisement, whether or not he realizes it. So, and again, it's not like this stuff hasn't been tried before, guys, in terms of like a new third-party movement. They tried to, remember the Reform Party? Trump was involved with the Reform Party. This was back when I was a child. There have been attempts at this before. Like, we'll have a real third-party movement with a lot of energy behind it, and it always peters out.
You know who could have done it? Bernie Sanders. Because people actually have been clamoring, for example, in the Occupy movement, independently of any particular politician, have been clamoring for medical reform. The whole U.S. medical system is ridiculous. Getting Medicare for all, etc. That's been a demand for a very long time. Student debt is a crisis. Housing and foreclosures, a crisis. On and on. So like you see, for example, in the recent past, last decade, the Occupy movement developed, people's grievances to a significant extent. It helped to articulate them. Occupy as a movement, not all that successful. It existed. It had the impact that it had. And people did come together to articulate some of their complaints and to have discussions that probably did help people along in their political education and class consciousness. Okay, fine. But you do need to take political power. And so Bernie Sanders comes along. His platform is very similar to what people were talking about at Occupy, because these are real problems people are facing in the United States. He didn't really address the role of U.S. empire in maintaining capitalism throughout the world. Hence, the foreign policy was, I would say, just gone, missing. And it's a conspicuous absence in a country like the United States, which is, like I said, most responsible for holding down movements for progressive change anywhere in the world. Anyway, so that happened. Bernie Sanders absolutely could have. He was filling stadiums, could have started, either funneled it into the Green Party at the end of 2016, been like, all right, yeah, vote for Hillary, but we're going to come back in the 2018 midterms and we're going to crush all of you. He could have funneled that into the Green Party, built a better organization there, or done an independent left party. He didn't do it, funneled it into the Dems. How is that going? That's going to be the very next video I put up on the channel. It's not going well. He has watered it down to the point of being unrecognizable, just like AOC and the squad. So that's what you get when you work within the Dems. The reason I think that Perot failed is he was just trying to create another center-right party. There's no real point to that. You already have two of them. So it's not really an alternative. But a left party, people do want that. Again, whether you're winning elections or not, I'm sure you would win some. You have at least a base for people to organize outside of a corporate atmosphere. We do need something like that. So anyway, I wonder if he's going to mention that.
And I think we're going to see a similar thing with this. The planks I like are number 1 and number 5. All the other ones are very vague in general. And I just don't think it's enough to generate a movement and to make a real impact. And like I told you guys, there are aspects of Andrew Yang I really like. He wants to decriminalize all drugs. That was to the left of Bernie Sanders. UBI I love. But there's other things that I think were not great at all, that I think were really terrible. And that stuff is going to matter. And here's another example. $15 minimum wage. He's against it. He's against it because, like I said, in some ways he's more libertarian on economics than somebody like myself is. I think that's a fair comment. And he's not for $15 minimum wage. He was horrendous on Israel-Palestine and a bunch of foreign policy questions. So is there enough of a personality and a leadership and an ideology there to spark a true movement that can last and that can change American politics with our terrible two-party system where you have Coke and Pepsi, and he's trying to start RC Cola and take over? I don't think it's going to happen, Andrew. I really don't.
So yeah, Kyle is calling him an independent personality or, a unique personality. Come on. He's a grifter and a con man. That's what he is. He's a meme and a joke, and no one should take him seriously at all. Also, again, we keep coming back to the libertarian side of things, which is, if anything screams charlatan in politics, it's libertarianism. Remember I was talking about UBI and keeping wages low? Okay, that tracks again with the opposing $15 minimum wage, which to me, honestly, what is the point of even taking a job for less than that? You're not going to be able to buy anything with the money you're making. So yeah, anybody telling you that in 2021 they're for allowing businesses to pay workers less than 15. It's ridiculous. You're not going to be able to fucking buy anything. You're not going to be able to support yourself. So that's a joke. Yang is a joke. And I don't know. I wish he would go away. Who does he keep attracting? It's kind of sad. Anyway, I think it's some of this, middle class aspiring to be more affluent. You're living in the past. It's delusional. And on the $15 minimum wage thing, for as much as Yang wants to talk about the fourth industrial revolution and how productivity of robotics and things is going to skyrocket, well, one of the fundamental conversations about that is that capitalists are making more and more profit because labor, you can do more per labor hour. Like human labor has been made more productive with the use of high technology. Now you can expend very little effort. You can press a button and do a huge amount of work, by just issuing a command to a computerized system. That wasn't possible 50 years ago. So workers are far more productive now, and yet that productivity and the gains from the productivity, that's the point, is not being at all redirected towards the people creating that wealth. It's all getting trapped at the top because in capitalism, the goods and services created by workers at the point of production in a workplace become the legal property of the capitalist who owns the thing, not the people who produced it. This is the basic problem. And it's all just getting funneled upwards. All that increased productivity, it's just going to the people who own the economy. There's your problem. Yang doesn't want to address that. The UBI is just to keep people from like totally starving. That's not really the problem fundamentally that we're trying to address here. We can do a lot better than this sort of basic subsistence here. You know, we now set up this socialized panhandling system to give you a quarter so you don't, you know, completely pass out on the street kind of thing. We can go way beyond that if we get rid of capitalism. This is not what Andrew Yang is aiming at all. We can and must do much better than this. Let's finish off this video.
And I think that a lot of the enthusiasm that was around him originally, I do think a lot of it has sort of tapered off, because even some of his biggest fans were really turned off by certain takes he had, including the Israel-Palestine one was the big one. That was the real turning point in the mayor race, and that was the big turning point for a lot of people who were big Andrew Yang stans. You just can't be that bad on foreign policy and cheer on the, you know, destruction of Gaza and pretend like Israel's the victim and then have, you know, outsiders love you. That's not an outsider perspective. That is the ultimate pro-establishment insider perspective. And so, even though in some ways I like Andrew Yang, I do think this is sort of doomed to fail, but needless to say, I'll be keeping my eye on it.
All right, so that's the end of the video, of course, and I've heard worse takes from Kyle Kulinski. I mean, he also seems to be of the opinion that Yang is a lukewarm fraud and a charlatan. You know, okay, fine. I think that you could call this out a little bit more directly. Kyle, of course, you know, is in the game now where he's got to be somewhat congenial to these people to maintain the kind of standing that he is and to stay as close to the system of electoral politics, putting as much stock in that as he does. And what I'm saying to you, the audience listening to this at Socialism for All, is join an org, get involved. But, you know, this whole thing of getting wrapped up in Democratic Party politics and the capitalist election system in general, it's a recipe for depression and disappointment and disempowerment, because you give them your belief in your mind, and then that puts a leash on your emotions, and it just jerks you all around. And you don't want that, for obvious reasons, I think. So, you know, this is the big drawback of this type of thinking. Kyle is not embracing any sort of revolutionary politics and is very much working within the box, which is just really taking everyone who subscribes to it nowhere and really wasting your time. I literally think the U.S. working class has a better chance at freedom and ending oppression by embracing Marxism than these sort of silly games rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic while the entire capitalist political and economic systems go off of a cliff, because these views of social democracy will become irrelevant. And at some point, I mean, in the not too distant future, you're just going to wind up fighting for a bygone system if you're not already. So yeah, the future is socialist. I don't know that Kyle Kulinski is on board with that future. So these are the politics of the past. I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. If you'd like to help out without making a donation, very understandable. Liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, clicking the notifications bell. All that helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm, helps more people to see this content, helps to expand the conversation about ending capitalism and building socialism. Whatever it is you do online and in your community for those purposes, thanks for doing it, and we'll catch you in the next video.